All right, we are live. Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to Conscientious Omnivore. My name is Pal. Today, I've got two guests joining. We're going to be talking about health topics related to veganism and a few other things. But I'll just do a quick intro for myself. If anybody's watching for the first time, I have a channel here doing videos mostly about gardening, health, and veganism and ethics, stuff like that. So yeah, that's it for me. I'll pass the floor over to the guys, and then they can say a few words about themselves. So if you want to start first, Millennial Prepster, you can go first, and then we'll go over to BRBWaffles.
Sounds good. Hey, everybody. Been discussions, debates with conscientious omnivore before, so some of you guys might know who I am. Yeah, I'm all about permaculture. My biggest thing is sustainability. I'm all about, I really think it's important to grow food. I think food is something that has been lost on a lot of different facets, from just understanding what food is, where it comes from, the inputs, and just the basic concepts that I think we had, or at least our great grandparents had, that have been lost. And I think it's important to talk about those, because I think health, directly coincides with diet. So that's kind of a little bit about me.
Okay. Thanks, man. Nick, do you want to go next? Just a few words about yourself.
And my cat gets in the way. So my name is Nick. I am a former human nutritional science student. Went to the University of Manitoba, studied human nutritional sciences for a little while. I did not finish that undergraduate degree, but nutrition is my wheelhouse. But I typically research a wide variety of topics, mostly related to health and nutrition. I've done quite a bit of research into chronic disease and things like that. So that's kind of my perspective, where I'm coming from.
Cool. All right. Thanks. So I guess I just wanted to make sure everybody can hear in the channel. I just typed a message. Not sure if anybody who's watching, if somebody can just confirm in the chat that all the audio is okay. I'm going to assume it is, because nobody said no, but hopefully it's all right. If it is off, can somebody just let me know, and then I can adjust people's mics. Just let me know. All right, cool. So just, I guess, a couple of quick words about why this got set up. We had a debate with Carnival last week, and it was supposed to be a debate about ethics, which I think he was slightly confused about, because he kept trying to bring it back to health-related matters, but that's neither here nor there. There were some issues that Nick found with some of the statements that I made, and then he messaged, left a comment saying that we should talk. So then I kind of checked out his channel, and I took issues with some of the stuff he had in a video where he was talking about choline, nutrient, and the nutrient choline. And then we had some exchanges back and forth in the comments, and then we had some emails. So then we said, sure, let's talk, and that's how this got set up. So I mean, that's it in a nutshell of why we're talking. And I think, Nick, if you're okay, I think what I would do is you asked me an email kind of to lay out my thinking of why I believe that eating animal products, contributes or causes heart disease. And then maybe I'll just read through those 5 points as a starter, and then we can kind of, break it down from there, if that's cool with you.
Sure.
Okay. And yeah, before I even read them, I just want to say for the record that, like I've said before, I don't think there's any definitive proof that that is a cause of heart disease, or that it's the only cause of heart disease. It's just that there's a lot of incriminating evidence that kind of points to that direction. So that's all I'm really saying.
And I'm not even really against the idea of meat being a cause, but to say it's the cause is something that I take issue with. To have it a cause, and maybe even potentially context dependent, like that, I'm perfectly okay with accepting that as a potential reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's fine. And, like I said in my email, so I'll just read it just so that everybody has the benefit of kind of where we're coming from. So I said, yeah, I know there isn't direct proof that shows beyond a shadow of a doubt that eating animal products causes heart disease, but here's my thinking on the matter. So I go through 5 points. So the first point I say is that there's been thousands of autopsies done on young people who have died in accidents, and when they looked at their arterial health, what they found was that atherosclerosis begins in childhood. So children as young as like 8 years old already had the first stages of the disease. Fatty streaks were already forming in some of their arteries. And in the subsequent autopsies that they did on literally thousands of people, they showed that high LDL levels were the greatest risk factor for the heart disease that they were finding. Then I said, my second point is that there's lots of data to show that for people with total cholesterol levels below 150 mg per DL, so per deciliter, and LDL levels below 70 milligrams per deciliter, atherosclerosis doesn't occur even in the presence of other risk factors associated with heart disease. So the other risk factors are kind of things like being obese or smoking or, sedentary lifestyle. And there's like a whole bunch of other things that generally, make heart disease worse. So that is the contention of people like William C. Roberts, who's been studying, heart disease and heart health for like 50 plus years and has authored like, I believe, hundreds of, journal articles and stuff like that. So that's the second point. The third point that I said was that there are also people with genetic mutations which result in extremely low cholesterol levels, and they have significantly lower rates of heart disease. And those people, even if they are doing the other things like smoking, being overweight, et cetera, they still have that reduced risk rate. So it's pretty, interesting. And then there's another variation of a genetic mutation where people have very high cholesterol levels. And these people will die from heart disease very early in life. So they'll often die in their 30s or 40s unless they're treated aggressively with statin drugs to lower their cholesterol levels. The fourth point I said was that dietary saturated fat and cholesterol raise blood serum cholesterol levels. And this has been shown like back from, I believe it was in the 60s or 70s when Dr. Hextat was doing his, there's an equation that is named after him, the Hextat equation, which shows I believe it's the change in cholesterol with the increase of dietary saturated fat and cholesterol. So it's basically like a progression that shows that if you eat more saturated fat and cholesterol, and again, to a point, because you can level off, and at that point, if you eat more, it doesn't go up any higher. But so to a point, it does track together. And the last point on there was that, saturated fat is found primarily in animal foods, and cholesterol is found only in animal foods. Then the last point I had was the fifth point, which was that, the only way I've seen to obtain a total cholesterol of lower than 150 or an LDL of lower than 70 without the use of statin drugs is to basically eat a predominantly plant-based diet or almost a completely whole food plant-based diet. So those are my kind of like 5 points. And again, I acknowledge right off the bat that they are not like a smoking gun proof that like, yes, eating animal products will cause you heart disease. It's just these things indicate very strongly to me that if you want to avoid heart disease, you would be, kind of smart to eat a whole food plant-based diet. So, right. I'll hand it over to you, Nick, if you want to kind of address these.
Well, okay. I'll just start with total cholesterol, because I think total cholesterol is a red herring. Total cholesterol doesn't tell you a whole lot about the lipoprotein subfractions and their cholesterol content. It doesn't give you any of that information. So total cholesterol, we used to think that it was a pretty pretty good correlate for heart disease, because you typically find elevated cholesterol in people who had heart disease. But is that to say that the elevated cholesterol caused the heart disease, or the heart disease is part of a greater pathological milieu of which high cholesterol is a part? And when you track the disease, you often find the elevated cholesterol because perhaps the disease is causing the elevated cholesterol. Now, total cholesterol, like I said, might not be we know it's not the best marker anymore, because you can have a correlate that correlates pretty well. And then when you add better evidence and better correlates, that correlation can break down in comparison. So we thought total cholesterol was pretty good. And then that correlation broke down when we brought LDL cholesterol into the game. And then that correlation broke down when we brought LDL particle count into the game. And then that correlation broke down when we brought small dense LDL into the game. And then that correlation broke down when we brought insulin resistance into the game. And the insulin resistance and small dense LDL seem to coincide pretty much at a 1-to-1 ratio with one another. So at the end of the day, the best correlate for heart disease that I've found in the literature is remnant cholesterol. So this is your total cholesterol minus your LDL and HDL, because there are many other lipoprotein subfractions that hold cholesterol, and some of them shouldn't be in your bloodstream. For example, you have VLDLs, IDLs, and chylomicron remnants, and then LDL. And then you have about 7 subfractions of LDL, and you have about 3 subfractions of HDL. So VLDL is supposed to carry triglyceride to peripheral tissues from the liver. And chylomicrons carry triglyceride to peripheral tissues, and then eventually the liver through the lymphatic system. So these things have a very short half-life in the blood. They usually don't last more than 30 minutes in the blood. Chylomicrons are cleared within 30 minutes. VLDL is cleared within 30 minutes. IDL has such a short half-life, it's gone in a matter of minutes. LDL sticks around for days. So if you get a fasting blood draw and your remnant cholesterol, which is your total cholesterol minus LDL and HDL, that's everything that's supposed to be cleared from the serum. And that's a marker of insulin resistance, because the thing that pulls the actual triglyceride out of the lipoprotein is lipoprotein lipase, which is upregulated in response to serum insulin. Now, if you're insulin resistant, you're not going to be upregulating the LPL and pulling the triglyceride out of the lipoproteins. And if you're not pulling the triglycerides out of the lipoproteins, they can't go anywhere and they hang out in the blood. And we know that diabetes, metabolic syndrome, metabolic dysfunction in general correlates the best with heart disease. So if you wanted to pin it on anything, I would say that the best correlate we have to date right now is insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. That the general diabetic phenotype is what best correlates with heart disease and what best explains heart disease in the vast majority of the literature. So the data that you're referring to, more or less, is observational data from the early 40s, 50s, and 60s, and a little bit into the 70s. The autopsy data, again, it's a correlate. They found atherosclerotic plaques and elevated serum cholesterol levels. So they wanted to assume those things were causal, which, given the state of the science back there, given the state of American science back there, you can't blame them for making that assumption. But again, it's just a correlate. And now we have really strong mechanistic data, and we know exactly, more or less, what causes heart disease. I do agree that LDL is part of the puzzle. So you mentioned that people who have a genetic predisposition to extremely low LDL seem to have a somewhat...
They don't just have low LDL, though. They have low total cholesterol.
Well, they also have low total cholesterol because, like I said, LDL hangs around in the blood for 3 days. It is the largest fraction of your total cholesterol, usually, is LDL. So that's why actually they thought that LDL and total cholesterol could be interchanged with one another. Like back when it was really difficult to measure LDL, the researchers would tell the doctors to just measure total cholesterol because they correlated well enough, but they didn't really correlate that well, but they tried to get away with it. But anyway, so there are people with a condition called hypobeta lipoproteinemia, and these people basically don't make ApoB. So they can't make ApoB containing lipoprotein particles. So that's chylomicrons and VLDL and eventually LDL. So VLDLs become IDLs and then become LDLs. Chylomicrons are moved from your intestines. They become chylomicron remnants. Your liver takes them up when they've been depleted of triglyceride. And the people who secrete no LDL particles, so they don't have any VLDL, they don't have any IDL, they don't have any LDL. Well, yeah, they have a superhuman immunity to atherosclerosis, but they also die in their 30s. So because it's impossible for them to get fat-soluble nutrients into their tissues. It's literally impossible, especially vitamins A, D, and K into bone. Like, that's a big issue for them. They have bone deformities. They have all sorts of problems. So
I
it's
haven't
true.
heard that before. So if you can, maybe afterward, like just send me a link on that. I've never heard that. I thought that they could live well into like late.
That's people with single nucleotide polymorphisms where they have an impairment to cholesterol synthesis. Now, those people can live perfectly normal lives, and in some cases, they actually gave them cholesterol supplements in order to augment their own endogenous cholesterol synthesis because it was impaired. Same thing with people with Smith-Lemli-Opitz syndrome. They don't really make a whole lot of cholesterol on their own, and some people really just don't make virtually any. So they needed to dose these people with high level cholesterol, pharmacological doses of cholesterol, in order to keep them alive. So
yeah, definitely send me that, because I've never heard that. So
yeah.
I would love to read up on that some more.
So it's true that if you have virtually no LDL in your bloodstream, you will have a superhuman immunity to atherosclerosis. It is also true that if you have familial hypercholesterolemia, you will be severely predisposed to atherosclerosis. So hypercholesterolemia, familial hypercholesterolemia, is basically, it can be a disruption to the LDL receptor. It could be a disruption to PCSK9, which is a protein that breaks down a protein that breaks down the LDL receptor, or I think it. So let me think about this for a second. Yeah, it's PCSK9 breaks down the LDL receptor, I believe. But anyway, these people who have these genetic mutations that actually increases their serum cholesterol to very, very large amounts, these people tend to get atherosclerosis quicker. Now, does this mean that cholesterol causes heart disease? I still don't think that that's the case, because when you actually read up on the pathophysiology of atherosclerosis, basically the very first thing that happens is, and people always hate it when I say this, but when you read the data, this is exactly what's going on. Something happens to the endothelium in your artery. Some kind of endothelial insult. It could be anything. Viruses cause atherosclerosis. Oxidative stress from smoking and vitamin E depletion cause atherosclerosis. Lack of vitamin K causes atherosclerosis. Anything that presents as an attack or insult to the artery wall is going to facilitate atherosclerosis given enough time. Now, the mechanism by which the cholesterol gets into the intima, which is the space below the endothelial layer of your artery. So you have an endothelium, you have your intima, and then underneath you have the media, which is the smooth muscle tissue. Particularly in your heart is smooth muscle tissue, not skeletal muscle tissue. So you have the endothelium, intima, and then the media. So in the intima is where all the magic happens. There is some kind of insult that presents itself, which triggers an inflammatory response, which upregulates these receptors on the endothelium called low-density lipoprotein receptors, or LDLR. So you upregulate the LDLR because tissues do this when they're in danger. The reason tissues do this is because when your tissues are in danger, they need to, through endocytosis, which is taking in bodies from outside of a cell and moving it inside the cell. Through endocytosis, they move those LDL particles into the cell and then catabolize them. They break them apart, because what are they rich of? Like, what are they full of? They're full of phospholipids, they're full of cholesterol, and they're full of cholesterol ester, and they're full of fat-soluble vitamins. Those are everything that you need. And they're full of protein. Like, some of them are 50% protein by weight. This is everything that you need to build a cell, right? So you could think of LDL in a way as kind of like an egg, right? And it's like everything you need to build a chick, but in this case, it's everything you need to build a cell. So they pull in these LDL particles. They use the cholesterol to add fluidity to the cell membrane. They use the phospholipids to build new cell membranes. They use the fat-soluble vitamins for all sorts of different metabolic pathways. So when a tissue is in danger, it expects to need more LDL particles. And in fact, your liver is designed to respond to characteristic cytokine profiles in your blood that are characteristic of inflammation. So your liver can shuttle out VLDL very rapidly. Actually, considering the size of the VLDL particle as a macromolecule, it is mobilized so incredibly quickly. These things can leave your liver in a matter of minutes, and they're gigantic particles compared to anything else in your bloodstream. So like your body is designed to move these things out quickly. And tissues that are in danger need cholesterol and phospholipid, and they take up these particles. But sometimes what happens is that the insult that's attacking the artery wall is so persistent and so pervasive that you can keep on taking in LDL particles far in excess of what you actually need to repair the problem, because the inflammation is chronic and progressive. So what happens is these LDL particles hang around because the body plans on using them, but they can get invaginated through the top of the endothelial cell and then get extruded through the bottom, through the basal area of the endothelial cell, and end up in the intima. And when they're in the intima, they hang around there until they're either used or a macrophage eats them, and the macrophage is part of the inflammatory process. So they get oxidized, and then when an LDL particle gets modified or oxidized, your immune system has to dispose of it. And in fact, LDL particles are designed to be modified. The ApoB protein, the apolipoprotein beta 100, that's on the LDL particle, that particular protein is designed to be modified by certain molecules, particularly, like the best example is in sepsis. So if you measure somebody's LDL when they're septic, it's through the roof, because they need to shuttle out so many of these VLDL particles, because the apolipoprotein B100 is actually designed to bind to lipopolysaccharide. So lipopolysaccharide is something that's secreted from your gut. In the case of leaky gut syndrome, it can cause sepsis. And these LDL particles mop it up like part of the immune system. And what happens to things when your immune system is mopping them up? They go to macrophages. So the LPS can modify the LDL particle. That cuts off its transport to LDL receptors, because the ApoB has been modified. So it no longer functions as a functional ligand for the LDL receptor. Now, what happens to the LDL particle at that point is it becomes a modified LDL particle. And the modified LDL particle goes to the macrophage through a couple different pathways. There's LOX1, so that's lectin-like low-density lipoprotein receptor 1. That's the LOX1 receptor. That's a disposal receptor specifically through immune cells. Then there's the scavenger receptor A1 and A2, so SRA1, A2. Those modified LDL particles get disposed that way. So whenever there's an insult to the artery, macrophages are there to eat the damaged lipoprotein particles. So you could think about it like this. You have a fire, right? And firemen are showing up to the scene, and they keep on running into the building, and the building keeps collapsing around them. And the firefighters just keep running in the building and dying over and over and over again. Now, when the house finally burns down, collapses, and you get a heart attack, are you really going to say that the heart attack was caused by the pile of dead firefighters that you find? No, it was something else, right? Because the LDL particles wouldn't even be there if it weren't for some other insult that acted on the endothelium. And in the literature, the best insult, there are a couple insults. I mean, there are hundreds of insults that are potential here. Like you have viruses can cause atherosclerosis. Like I said, LPS, lipopolysaccharide from the gut, can cause atherosclerosis. You can get oxidized LDL particles. So there's actually a pretty significant correlation between one's dietary intake of linoleic acid and atherosclerosis, and oxidized lipoprotein particles in particular, because those fatty acids are uniquely vulnerable to lipid peroxidation cascades. So that's one way you could modify LDL particles. Another way you could modify LDL particles is through glycation. Glycation can modify LDL particles. So within somebody with a diabetic phenotype, they can have advanced glycation end products. They can have methylglyoxal, which is a reactive carbonyl species. They can have reactive oxygen species produced in excess. These things uniquely damage LDL particles and facilitate their disposal through macrophages. And when these insults are persistent, these macrophages take in so many LDL particles that they turn into something called foam cells. And that's actually, that's atherogenesis right there. That's the beginning of the atheroma, because once you get a foam cell, generally speaking, unless you can get that cholesterol out there, out of the foam cell, you have an apoptotic cell. So the cell dies. And then you get something in the atheroma called a necrotic core. And the necrotic core is basically where there's an angiogenic component to it. So you start vascularizing into it, and it just turns into a bloody mess. But again, none of this has to do with the LDL particle. All of this has to do with external insults to the LDL particle. So what I would really like to see out of the data is LDL, high LDL, or even high LDL particles taken in isolation from things that are typical to the diabetic phenotype, like low HDL, high triglycerides, insulin resistance, high glucose, high insulin. I'd like to see those things controlled for, and I'd like to see LDL actually isolated out as a unique causal agent in atherosclerosis. And I haven't seen that data yet. I haven't seen it. It as far as I know, it doesn't exist.
Okay, so let me ask you a couple questions, because there's actually kind of a lot in there. And, you know, I think just for anybody watching, that's an awful lot of, you know, technical terms and a bunch of stuff that, you know, is just way beyond, I think, what most people know. And it's way beyond me. So I'm not going to pretend like I even understood half of what you said. Mike, I don't know how you feel about that, but
I thought it was really good. I know I watched a lot of his. I kind of binge watched your channel, especially last night. So yeah, there's definitely, you know, I understand a little bit of it. I have a little bit of a medical background, but what I thought was really interesting is just all the other. What I want to look into now is just kind of looking what he said, other causal factors, whether we're talking about viruses and whether we're talking about other types of agents that could cause, you know, atherosclerosis, which I think is very interesting, especially when we're talking about kind of where I'm coming from as far as a sustainability permaculture setting. Just all the inputs that we are seeing put in our food, you know, weren't there, you know, in the 40s, weren't necessarily there earlier on. So, you know, all these other causal agents that he's talking about, those would be really interesting to look at. And, you know, talking about viruses, we know that viruses have definitely mutated, and they're always mutating. So that's another factor to look at. So when you're talking about just all the different inputs in food, when you're talking about just how viruses are genetically modifying and how you look at our lifestyle becoming more and more sediment as the generations progress, I think there's definitely a lot there to unpack. And I think he does make a good argument that, you know, maybe we should be looking at more than just meat, you know? So I think that's a really good.
Here's another thing. I won't completely write off meat as not being a causative agent, because there are some people who have unique microbiota and the composition of their microbiome lends itself to producing this substance called TMAO. And TMAO can act as an agent that can attack the arterial intima. But the thing is that that's not unique to the meat. That's an individual reaction to the meat when they have dysbiosis. Right. So the dysbiosis. Well,
actually, what I know about TMAO is that it's actually created from choline. So, but choline content is especially high in red meat, and it's especially high in eggs and dairy and fish.
But that's not to say that the choline in eggs, dairy, and fish always makes TMAO. It only makes TMAO in pathological amounts within certain contexts. So some people with dysbiosis do this more than other people, and some people don't do it at all, right? So it's not a unique...
There's an interesting study that Dr. Greger shows on one of his Nutrition Facts videos, where they took vegans who had been vegan for at least 5 years. And the thinking was that they would have different microbial gut flora. So they have they had these vegans, and clearly, I guess they weren't ethical vegans, but they actually were fed products high in choline. So they were fed like steaks or 2 eggs or whatever, something like that. And they would look for the TMAO in their bloodstream afterward. And in a regular meat eater, it would be shown that it was there, and in the vegan person, it wouldn't. But if you take someone who is a vegan and consistently feed it to them long enough that their gut flora actually adjusts to eating the meat, they will start producing the TMAO as well.
But I don't exactly know whether or not that effect is persistent, chronic, or transient. So it could very well be transient, and it could very well still be in relation to what else they're eating in their diet. And even if you're always producing TMAO when you eat meat, the data that links it to heart disease is still just correlation. So when I say that the TMAO could act as an insult to the arterial wall, that's actually me just bootstrapping that from the correlation data. We don't actually have mechanistic data that implicates that particular molecule into atherosclerosis. It may be, and there's also we're not entirely sure whether or not this molecule could even have a hormetic effect. It's possible that low levels of pathological agents in your body could actually be beneficial. Like in the context of blueberries, a lot of people tout blueberries as something that's excellent for you because they're loaded with antioxidants, but these antioxidants actually act in our body like pro-oxidants, and our body works very, very hard to dispose of them as soon as they get into our bodies. And
I would want to see some qualification of that statement, because I've never heard anybody say that.
No, well, I mean, like, think about it. The antioxidants that keep a blueberry from oxidizing are not the same as the antioxidants that are primary components in our endogenous antioxidant system. So we have like glutathione, we have vitamin C, we have vitamin E, we have all of these different, like carnitine, we have all of these different antioxidants in our bodies. Or I think carnosines, I might be wrong about that, but the antioxidants that these plants use to protect themselves are quite different, and they don't even enter into our antioxidant system the way that you'd expect them. They act as pro-oxidants, and that's why they're actually good for you, because they are an insult to the body that the body needs to dispose of. So the reason that they're good is because your body actually builds up defenses to these things the longer you're exposed to them. And those defenses actually make your body hardier over the long term. So that's why you find beneficial outcomes with people who are consuming things like blueberries or consuming, colorful vegetables that have a lot of antioxidants in them. It's not because the antioxidants are actually good in and of themselves. It's that our body's response to them and our body's capacity to dispose of them makes our bodies more robust the more they're exposed to them. So that could be the case. I
think, ultimately, like what I would say to that is that, like we're in agreement. Eating blueberries is good for you. Like, how that is good for you. I mean, again, I've never heard it put the way you've put it. I would definitely love to read up more on that.
It's just called hormesis. Like the process is called hormesis. This is like the established mechanism for why these phytochemicals are actually good for you in some ways. It's a process called hormesis. It's your body building up not immunity, but building up tolerances to pathological agents that actually increases the robustness of your body over time. And I can't rule out the same thing with TMAO, because there are pathological like things that are in plants that our body tries really hard to get rid of, and they're bad for us. But that's the reason that they're good for us, is because they make it interesting that you're trying to
suggest that like TMAO is similar in any way, shape, or form to the effect of like the antioxidants in blueberries, because like all the correlation, I've never seen any correlation from blueberry consumption or antioxidant consumption, for that matter, to be correlated with any kind of disease or illness. But with TMAO, it's very strongly correlated with cancer, heart disease, and like basically overall death rate.
So who has TMAO in their system?
Everybody, to my understanding, because everybody has choline produced, and it's just the amount. And the amount that you have goes up the more choline you consume.
Just the levels that have been identified as potentially problematic, who has those levels in their blood?
Well, you tell me, because it seems like you probably know more.
Well, no, I mean, you were telling me earlier, it's meat eaters, right? Who doesn't listen to their doctor?
No, I didn't say it was meat eaters.
You say people who eat choline-rich foods tend to have more TMAO in their bloodstream, and it's more heavily represented in meat eaters.
And they have like studies that you can actually show that you do like a blood sample from the person. You have them eat like 2 eggs or a steak or whatever, something else that's high choline. Then you do another blood sample like the few hours later once it's gone into the digestion. And it's like whatever, 3 to 4 hours later, their TMAO spikes like really high. And then like 6 hours later or whatever, once you've digested it, it comes back down.
Okay. So who would have those levels?
Yeah.
Meat eaters.
Yeah, well, I mean,
meat eaters.
Not necessarily meat. It's in dairy and fish as well. So you could be like pesco-vegetarian or whatever as well.
Animal product consumers.
Yes.
People who are consuming animal products. Who is more likely to have less healthful lifestyle choices in general? The person who is not listening to their doctor and is eating a ton of eggs and red meat, or the person who is listening to their doctor and eating a lot of blueberries? Who is more likely to be more healthful overall?
Yeah, that's an obvious answer. But the thing is, like, you're basically, I don't know where you're going with this, but it sounds like you're going to suggest something that a lot of people always try to do and try to make it sound like these studies don't account for the differences in lifestyles, which they all try to do.
They all try to do, but they all fail. Like, I mean, most of them fail. Most of them fail. When you're dealing with correlations like this, I'm less compelled. I think it's a lot more helpful if we had solid mechanistic data. Like, if you could show me how eating TMAO, like eating choline and having it be metabolized to TMAO, entering into the bloodstream, causes or is a prevalent cause of heart disease. I'm not saying it can't be a cause of heart disease, but if you can show me that it correlates well above and beyond something like insulin resistance, then I might buy the idea that meat causes heart disease the same way smoking causes lung cancer, right? Then I might be able to accept it. But for now, I think there is a far tighter correlate than just TMAO. I think it's a red herring for the most part.
Yeah, okay. And I mean, so there's like insulin resistance too. That is also very strongly correlated again with, animal product consumption as well. So
yeah, in the observational data. But that completely breaks down in the RCTs. There are over 70 RCTs where people are eating ostensibly high meat diets, and they're reversing metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, diabetes. And I sent you like at least 10 of those studies, I think. Like,
well, yeah, I mean, you sent me a bunch of studies for the record yesterday, and I haven't been able to go through all but basically only one of them. So I've only been able to go through one of them, and I will be looking through them because they are very interesting. But I think
that's.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I think that's a good point, because I think this is a good point that actually you guys kind of both bring up. Especially I'm sitting here and I'm somebody who, cultural wise, is from the blue zone. Both my parents are from different parts of the blue zone, and so whenever I feel like we get talking about veganism versus non-veganism, we always like to lump this very general, oh, you're a meat eater, so what is considered meat eating to one person isn't what's considered meat eating to another person. Take myself, for example, who grows his own food, especially his own meat. Meat production for me is probably the easiest thing I do, just because of the livestock that I use. And so when you start looking at like the Costa Rican study, when you start looking at the Okinawan study, and you start looking at all these different people, I'm plant-based. Like the majority of what I eat is plant-based. Now, are there are there some meats in there? Sure. But when you're looking at, probably me and BRBWaffles diet and how we look at food versus how your typical family that eats at McDonald's and eats a lot of fast food, processed foods, it's totally different. I'd be the first person, to raise my hand and shun that kind of that lifestyle, because that's not, you can say that's carnist, that's meat eating, and so is what I do, but it's way different, and even how we look at diet's way different. So I think that's really something, to look at. We're not all the same. Just like when I'm starting to find out about vegans, not all vegans are the same, especially what you do. I mean, that's why I have a lot of respect for your channel, Conscientious, just because of what you're trying to do, and I see that, because that's how I was grown. That's how I was taught to live. And that's how my culture, is. So the fact that you're going out there, what you're doing is not common in the vegan community at all. I mean, I find it way more easy to talk to omnivores about permaculture than I do vegans, So I think it's important to note that not all vegans are like you, and not all meat eaters are like, me and BRB. So it's also something that I feel like when we're looking at these studies, they don't really address really all that well. And when we start to look at plant-based in general, even people that do intake, some kind of animal products, they're way more vastly healthy than the rest of the population. The blue zone peoples have the longest living, healthiest populations of people, So I think when we're talking about the meat topic, we got to really put in perspective. I'll be the first one to say that, the meat that comes out of, big slaughterhouses and the meat that we're seeing in fast food industries, it's not good. I'm not eating it. I wouldn't recommend other people eating it. But there's a big difference. And I think when we're talking about correlation, I think a lot of that's lost in the studies and in translation, really. So I just kind of throw that tidbit in there right quick.
I just think that like if you're going to rely on nothing but correlative data to guide your decision making, you could come up with some pretty silly decisions. Like, for example, shoe size correlates with reading comprehension. So I mean, like, does wearing big shoes make you read better? No, of course not. So you really have to take the correlation data with a grain of salt. When you have actual mechanistic data, that's different.
There is mechanistic data, though, for a lot of the things that we've talked about. And I mean, so some of the things that we talked about are correlative, but there is mechanistic data to show that you consume dietary cholesterol and saturated fat, it will raise your blood serum cholesterol. Now, I want to go back to something that you said before, because you said that, there are different things that can initiate that insult to the endothelial lining. So that's fine. There are different things that can initiate the thing. But what the first point that I mentioned, I think it was the first point anyway, was that William C. Roberts and other, doctors who have been studying it for a long time have shown is that if your total cholesterol is below 150, and this goes back to what you said about the people with the genetic, mutation, if your cholesterol is low enough, you simply cannot have, enough of the cholesterol in there to form the plaques. So it's like, it's a prerequisite. It needs to be there. You have to have enough cholesterol in there to form the plaques. So if you, and that is not a, that is not a correlative thing. That is like a mechanistic thing. They've shown.
So
that's what I'm saying. It's not just all correlative, and that is a mechanistic thing. And also it's a mechanistic thing that shows that you can increase your blood serum cholesterol by consuming the animal products. And for anybody who's like doubting this or whatever, just, go on a whole food plant-based diet for a month, check your cholesterol, then start eating animal products again. It's going to go up. I mean, that part is not arguable. Like, this is the part that in the email exchange we had, I called this a bait and switch, because you're arguing for two different things. This is you're talking about the lipid hypothesis one second, then you're talking about the diet heart hypothesis another second, and those two are completely different. So the lipid hypothesis is just having lipids in the blood causes heart disease, or having more cholesterol in the blood causes again, I didn't say anything about, I didn't say a cause. I said that it's a prerequisite for getting the plaques to build. So
you have no argument from me. You have no argument then from me that you need to have cholesterol in the blood in order to in order to have the LDL particles and in order to have the LDL particles go into those tissues, they need to be in the blood. No argument from me.
Perfect. Good.
But the LDL particles themselves are not initiating the problem unless the LDL particles are damaged. That's different.
Okay. I mean, and I'm not saying they are. So, I mean, I think,
well, then if they're not
what
damaged,
you just said, but with what you just said, that's all I wanted to say. So all I'm saying is, again, that it's a prerequisite, and you're agreeing. So if it's a prerequisite, and we've also said that having your cholesterol be lower than, let's say 150, there is no indication that is causing any kind of like damage. I don't think you would claim that either, would you? Like, my cholesterol is 107.
I don't think cholesterol in and of itself causes any damage to the artery unless you have.
So if we have no indication that being below 150 for a total will cause you any health problems, but we know that even if it's not a cause, but that it's a fundamental thing that needs to be there. It's a prerequisite that needs to be there to form the plaques. If it's over 150, it can form the plaques.
Well,
then wouldn't it be prudent? Wouldn't it be prudent But you just said you agreed that it's a
No.
prerequisite. Like you need to have that level.
The cholesterol being in the bloodstream is the prerequisite. When you're starting to quantify the amount of cholesterol in the bloodstream, this is where it can kind of get a little screwy. So when you say a cholesterol of like say you have an LDL cholesterol of 100, even say it's 100. Now, what if that LDL cholesterol is distributed amongst an LDLP of 900, which is not correlated with heart disease? And then what if that 100 milligrams per deciliter is distributed amongst an LDLP of 3000? That's correlated with heart disease. So it's not the actual content of the cholesterol in your blood. It's the number of particles over which that cholesterol is distributed that actually determines the outcome. And James Odvos showed this. Like Jim Odvos, he's been demonstrating this correlate in his magnetic resonance lipoprotein scan since like 2011. He's been publishing papers showing this discordance where if you have somebody with high LDLP and low LDLC, they get a massive amount of heart disease. And if you get somebody with a high LDLP and a high LDLC, they have even more heart disease, but it's like barely any worse.
Yeah, I looked at the first study you sent me, and I can share my screen in a little bit because I did want to talk to you about some specific things I had questions on and wanted you to address. But my whole point is, though, that you're choosing an LDL that's already too high. That's what these doctors like William C. Roberts is saying. And you're picking 100 when they're saying that it should be below 70.
Okay, go 200. Go 200.
No, not 200. No, you're missing my point. I'm saying you go lower. The people that were in the study that you sent, they were like the people in the low group were 100, and that's too high, is what I'm saying. And that's what a lot of these plant-based doctors are saying. They're saying that your LDL should be below 70, and when you go below 70, you pretty much again fall into this category of there's not enough of it in there to actually form the plaques.
That's not based on any data.
It is based on data. It's based
That's
on.
not based on any data.
It is based on data.
No. Here, just let me speak for a little bit. This is not based on any data because I know honestly, like I don't know it for a fact, but I have not seen, and I have several people, I have lipidologists who follow me on Twitter who also will echo this sentiment. I have not seen a single study that implicates LDL cholesterol in isolation from every other lipid fraction, every single other lipid ratio that you could think of being deranged somehow, which means that it's a metabolic problem. It's not a problem of having cholesterol in the blood, right? Like, think about it this way. If you have no insult to your artery, let's just say I eat coconut oil. So you can't pin me on the cholesterol. You can't pin me on the animal product. Let's just say I eat coconut
on the saturated fat. They're one of the highest sources of saturated fat.
Okay.
And that will also raise your blood serum cholesterol.
Let me finish. If I eat the coconut oil and I raise my LDL cholesterol transitively, transiently, just very acutely raise the LDL cholesterol, bump it up a little bit 6 hours later, then it goes back down. If I eat the coconut oil and raise my LDL, but there is no insult to the artery, do I increase my chances of getting atherosclerosis?
Are you talking about a one-time event? You ate coconut oil and that's it?
Say I eat the coconut oil chronically for 10 years, but I never have an insult that can precipitate the LDL particles into the intima. I never have an inflammatory insult to the endothelium. Does my having more cholesterol, regardless of the particle number, increase my risk?
I don't know that, and if that were to be true, that you'd never had an insult, maybe you wouldn't. But my whole point is this. My whole point is this, though: if you're eating enough coconut oil to increase your total, cholesterol concentration, your total LDL concentration, and you do get that insult, now you have the prerequisite that you need to then make it into a problem, so to actually start the plaque to build up. And that's all I'm saying. So It's like, why wouldn't you like want to avoid that? Like, you can't guarantee you won't get one of these insults. Like you said, it could be from all these other sources. Like, it could be a virus. It could be from
here's the
something else.
thing.
So why would you make that condition be there waiting for that insult to happen?
Here's the thing. LDL-C doesn't correlate with heart disease at all. Remember what I said?
And that's what I want to jump into. So if you want, I'll share my screen, because this is in that study that you sent, and that doesn't follow from the study you sent. You wrote back and that's literally what you wrote, and you sent me the study that proves that point, and that's not what the study says.
So let's see it.
Yep, I'm going to share my screen. Give me 1 second.
Is this the James Ottfos study from?
It's the very first link, and I'll show it to you in just 1 second. I'm just sharing my screen now. All right, so it's the very first link you sent. I'll show you the top of it so you can see it. It is, yep, James Ottfos. Clinical implications of discordance between LDL cholesterol and the LDL particle number.
Yep.
Yep. So if you look at this and you just go, I mean, I've tried to read through the whole thing. I'll be honest. I mean, I didn't have much time, so I will look through it more carefully afterward. But it does not say that LDL-C levels don't correlate at all. It's just saying that there's better correlations between these other things. But it is not saying that it doesn't at all. And that's what you just started your statement with.
But here's the thing. Here's the thing.
I'm going to try to find the line, but go ahead.
If you read into the study, what you find is that there is a screwed up HDL to triglyceride ratio. What I'm saying is that there is no study that divulges LDL-C as a unique independent risk factor for atherosclerosis, independent of the HDL to triglyceride ratio also being screwed up, right? So this is the triglyceride to HDL ratio is an indicator of insulin resistance because it reflects CETP activity, the cholesterol ester transfer protein activity. Now, the LDL-C, when you adjust these studies for the HDL-C and the triglycerides being out of whack, you find out that that's a better correlation. And then when you look at the other lipoprotein subfractions, like the remnant cholesterol, the LDL-C correlation breaks down. So the correlation that they find in this study gets pushed into the floor when they further adjust for different lipoprotein subfractions and ratios. So what I'm saying is that, can you isolate LDL-C as an independent risk factor for atherosclerosis? I have not seen that data. I have not seen a single study that divulges poor HDL-C to triglyceride ratio independent of LDL-C, meaning LDL-C is uniquely deleterious to health independent of these other biomarkers being screwed up.
Again, I don't think that's what you were just saying before, though, and that's what I wanted to correct.
That's exactly what I was saying a moment ago.
What you said, and that's what got me to share the screen, was that LDL-C does not correlate, and it does. It's just that the other things correlate even better, and that there are sometimes tricky situations where you think the risk isn't as like, it's not quite as bad as you think it is. That's what this whole article is basically saying, that sometimes with the LDL-C being really like high, you think the risk is like really high, but it's actually not quite as scary as it really is. It's like slightly less bad, but they're still getting like tons of heart attacks. Like the difference is, between the risk is like, one of them is like really bad, and then the other one is like still pretty bad but less scary. It's like less bad. I mean, that's what this whole article is like going through. It's not saying that it doesn't correlate. And if you look at these charts, like I'm going to just go up, where is it? One that I want to show you. Sorry, it's hard to scroll here. Like this one is showing you the LDL-C, and then it shows you the different colored lines for the ones with the concordant, and then the ones where the LDL-P is higher than the LDL-C, and then the ones that they're lower. But they all correlate the same way. Basically, the higher the concentration, the more,
Well, what I'm saying is that these numbers only correlate in the context of, if you look at table 1, these numbers
Well, but let me just go through this
these numbers only
well,
correlate in the context of. Okay,
let me just go through this chart here. Then we'll go to the one that you want to look at. So this one is showing the carotid IMT. That's the intermedial thickness. I believe that's the abbreviation. So it's basically like how thick the wall is. The thicker it is, the worse it is, basically. And as you can see, they all like correlate. So even the people who fall in the concordant, those obviously follow that black line in the middle. The people with the bigger, what do you call it? Yeah, the LDLP being higher than the LDLC, those people still follow it. And then the people with the lower, they follow it too, but they're just at a slightly lower, rate or whatever. But it still tracks higher. So the higher it is, it's still bad. It's just less bad than if you just looked at the black line would indicate. That's all.
See, my point here is that these things only correlate in the context of their lipids looking the way they do. So when you look at table 1 and you see the
let me find it for you.
And you see discordant, the people who had lower instances of heart disease were in the discordant low LDLP group. And you see that they have lower triglycerides, higher HDL, and the group that was discordant for high LDLP, low LDLC had higher triglycerides and the lowest HDLC. See, this is the thing that's hidden in all of these cholesterol studies. This is the thing that's hidden in all of these cholesterol studies, is that the actual metabolic syndrome, the actual insulin-resistant phenotype, correlates best with everything because you never see it as not part of the puzzle. If you can find me a study, in fact, Dave Feldman right now is offering $300 to anybody who can offer him a study wherein high LDLC is an independent correlate with heart disease, independent of low HDL and high triglycerides. And this guy's followed by hundreds of doctors easily. A lot of them are cardiac surgeons.
Sorry, can you say that again? Repeat what the challenge is. He wants high
LDLC or even LDLP, independent of a screwed up HDL to triglyceride ratio, basically. But it can't be a drug study and it can't be a genetic study. That's his criteria. He has it all laid out on his website, and he's offering $300 to anybody who can find one of these studies. See, the thing is that there are better correlates hidden in the data if you know what to look for. And I think CETP activity, which is represented by the triglyceride to HDL ratio, is probably a better correlate than just, oh, the LDLC is high. Look, it's high and they're getting heart disease, therefore LDL is to blame. But what about the fact that regardless of what LDL is, like I sent you another trial called the Fourier trial, where they pushed people's LDLC down to 30 milligrams per deciliter. 30 milligrams per deciliter, and it did not stop 70% of cardiac events. They still had a ridiculous amount of cardiac events.
Okay, so let me, before we move on, is there anything else you want to say from this study before we start talking about another study?
No, because I'll say the same thing about every other study because they all show the same thing. So, okay. I mean, we could drop that particular subject if that's okay with you. I mean, I'll just say the same thing over and over and over and over again. The HDL to triglyceride ratio is a better correlate. In fact, they stopped using LDL in the atherosclerosis or heart disease risk calculators. They completely dropped LDLC because it's a useless marker. They go by ratios now. So you plug in your numbers and it goes by either triglyceride to HDL ratio, or it goes by HDL to total cholesterol ratio. LDL isn't even a part of their calculation anymore in terms of when they measure your risk of atherosclerosis. And if those things correlate better, and those things pretty much only correlate with insulin resistance, I would say insulin resistance is probably the fairer bet than meat,
Yep, that's fine. But again, like what I just want to keep going back to is, like, for anybody who's watching, it's as simple as this in my mind. Like, if you have the opportunity to keep your cholesterol levels low enough that regardless of the insult to the endothelial lining, If you don't have that high enough level that it won't build up, then why wouldn't you do that?
That's not entirely true either, because in the 4-year trial, which was a statin trial, but they used a pharmacological intervention, an HMG-CoA reductase inhibitor, to lower HDL or lower LDL cholesterol to 30 milligrams per deciliter, and these people still got heart disease. LDL-C is not the correlate. It's LDL-P. It's LDL-P in the context of low HDL, high triglycerides. LDL-C is useless.
So I have a question, just kind of listening, if you guys don't mind if I just jump in right quick. So when we're talking about animal products, are we, and we're looking at these studies, are we looking at what animal products they're eating? Are we looking at what kind of animals they're eating? Are we looking at as how much they're eating? You know what I mean? Because I'm looking at this.
I know.
No, I'm just saying, because I'm looking at this, if we're talking about like, hey, it's bad, and you have a guy like me who eats it, but I'm a plant-based omnivore, I guess, if you will. All the studies I've seen, plant-based diets actually reverse it. So when I'm looking at this and I have really low cholesterol altogether, I'm like, well, I don't really see what the, because I'm comparing myself to the people that would be in these studies. And I would say, just based upon what I eat alone, not to take into fact, exercise, family genetic factors, stuff like that. Like when we're really talking about it, like, does that play a role? What kind of meat they're eating, the frequency of that meat, how that meat, because if we're talking about inputs to ourselves, right? If we're talking how inputs affect our body, well, wouldn't the inputs of that animal also affect its health and its body? And then you consuming that. So I'm looking at this from, kind of a holistic point of view, obviously, because I don't have the vast expertise that you two have. But when I'm hearing these are automatically the questions that I'm thinking about. And I revert back to what we see from people that are on blue zone diets or the Mediterranean diets or a plant-based diet. They're living a lot longer, a lot healthier than the general population. So, that's kind of how I'm looking at it.
Well, here's an interesting thing. Like you were mentioning, is like, do these studies that show these correlations, do they even measure what kind of foods these people are eating? And my answer is just barely. And it's not even adequately. Like it's not even adequately. Just go onto Google and type in food frequency questionnaire template and just look at this thing. How they conduct these studies is they send out a whole bunch of food frequency questionnaires to a whole bunch of people in the cohort or in the prospective study, and then they get them to report back what they've eaten by memory. So you find questions like, in your best estimation, how many peaches have you had in the last 6 months? Right. And you have to recall from memory exactly how many peaches you've had in the last 6 months. And it's like, is that information really that good?
Well, and then
I think there's different
taking the fact. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
There's different quality surveys. I mean, I agree that many of them are like really bad. I mean, some of these like industry funded studies are like, they'll ask you to do like a 1-year recall, and then they'll never follow up with the person again, and they'll track them for 10 years or stuff like that.
Well,
I mean, that's
let's leave industry out of it.
There are things that there are things that are a lot better than that. I mean, there are things where people have to submit it every day, and then stuff like that. So they keep like a daily food journal. I mean, those things are a lot more reliable. There is like a gradient. It isn't just like one.
It's way harder to keep compliance with those studies, which is another confounder, because those people don't really want to log every single gram of food that they put into their mouths. And even then their memory is crap if they don't have their food frequency chart right in front of them to measure it for the day. But like, if you want, we could leave industry out of this. You could look at, say, a trial. This is a good one. Here's a trial, or it was a prospective study, but it wasn't really funded by industry. It was funded by the American Cancer Institution. It was the Adventist Health Study 2. So basically what they found in this study was that vegan men did way better than typical omnivores, but vegan women really dramatically increased the risk of heart disease relative to pescatarians.
Yeah, I saw that.
Right? Yeah. So it's like if the TMAO thing, and fish produces way more TMAO in the gut than most any other food, even more so than eggs. Like if the TMAO thing is really the strongest correlate for heart disease, how do you explain these women who cut their risk of heart disease in half eating a pescatarian diet relative to the vegans who increase their risk of heart disease by 40%?
Okay.
don't know.
I'm not familiar with the
I don't
details
know.
of that study. I will definitely look into that. So I can't comment on that. I don't know. I mean, I'll look at that. I have to take you at your word. I haven't heard that before.
It's probably the best perspective data that we have on vegans long term, because these people are vegan for religious reasons, and they've always been vegan.
And also with that study too, I think it's important to know, because I just did a video and I linked this on there because I used this study because it's the same one that Mick the Vegan used. And I saw that I saw that shift. Another thing to think about, if you look at the Gallup studies, 1 in every 8 Adventists is actually vegan, and only 41% are consistent vegetarians. So even when you're looking at that group of people, you can see how flawed it is, and they do it for religious reasons. And when you actually break down the ones that actually hold true to that diet,
and
it's even lower. So that's another thing to keep in mind too.
And here's another confounder: is part of their religious convictions to avoid animal foods. So what are the omnivores doing if they're not following their religious conviction? They're probably not following their doctor's orders either. They don't give a shit about anything. They're going to be eating whatever the hell they want. Chips.
Well, I'm not
Coca-Cola.
gonna make that leap there. But I won't
make the leap. But it's another possible confounder. It's a possible confounder is that these people have already demonstrated that they don't care in one capacity, and it's not that big of a leap to say that they might not care in another capacity, right?
Right.
Because this is supposed to be about health.
Right. Yeah. So, conscientious. If you want that link he's talking about, you can search for it. If you go to my last video, it's on there and it's annotated. I think it's funny that you mentioned that the same study. But yeah, I think it's important when we're talking about this. You got to really break it down. You got to look at lifestyle. You got to look at what the food is that you're eating and where's it coming from. I mean, even in the news, just the other day we saw that Monsanto had to pay out almost $300 million because we're just talking about herbicides. We're not even talking about pesticides and all the other stuff that goes into that, which I obviously like to come at it from that perspective. But yeah, I think it's good to note and mention. And I think when we're talking about it holistically, I think there's a lot of factors in there that you can't really account for. When you look at actual populations that do hold to, a plant-based diet, we're not seeing the issues there as much as we're seeing in other places. And then even with, I know somebody chimed in the comments talking about Okinawa and how they're no longer part of the blue zone. They still are part of the blue zone, but yeah, Japan, has been more Americanized. There's no doubt about that. And you notice when you look at those differences, you see more problems. So why aren't we focusing on that instead of just saying, oh, well, since Okinawa now has diabetic obesity problem, everything that was there before, just forget about it. I feel like that's the wrong way to look at it.
Here's another thing that's interesting about Okinawans is that the available autopsy data on Okinawan centenarians shows that they were heavily atherosclerotic, especially in the aorta. The aorta was covered with fatty streaks. There was like 40% occlusion in these people, which leads me to say another thing is that atherosclerosis probably is benign in and of itself, because the atherosclerosis isn't actually what causes the infarction. If you have atherosclerosis that never manifests as a myocardial infarction, why care? The Okinawans had atherosclerosis and never had heart attacks. The Inuit had atherosclerosis and they never had heart attacks.
Well, that's not true. Yeah, that's just completely like hearsay. I mean, the Inuit had like some of the worst health documented pretty much out of any like native peoples like ever. They had like the shortest lifespan. They had terrible bone health. They had osteoporosis. These are from like mummies from thousands of years ago.
I wouldn't call a lesser bone density osteoporosis per se.
I mean, they have mummies that have osteoporosis. It's not just lower bone density. They have osteoporosis and they have like severe.
Okay, but we're digressing. I'm not defending an Inuit diet here. We're digressing.
Yeah,
I'm talking about atherosclerosis as it relates to dietary protocol. So like the Okinawans had atherosclerosis. The Inuit had atherosclerosis, and when you crack open a Maasai warrior, they have atherosclerosis too. Everybody's got it because the best correlate of all, way and above insulin resistance, the best correlate for atherosclerosis is age, because oxidative stress is something that you can't outrun. Even vegans can't outrun this, right? So the best correlate is age. It is a very good bet that you will get atherosclerosis in your life. It's a very good bet that most of us are born with it. But but in most of us, it never manifests as a myocardial infarction, which is actually what everybody cares about. It's the end point that we care about.
Well, I would disagree with you on a couple
I don't
of
personally
things.
care.
One, Nick, it's not just like you get the heart attack and you die. The
No.
closing of the arteries is certainly impacting your health. Whether or not it actually leads to an actual heart attack is not the only problem. You're grossly like simplifying it by saying that. I mean, if nothing else, like erectile dysfunction is a direct like cause, or sorry, is a direct outcome of like atherosclerosis as well.
Listen, I'm not saying
the
that
penile artery being basically blocked and you're not getting erections. I mean, like, don't you think people would care about that if nothing else? I mean,
I'm not
like
trying to
really simplifying it too much.
I'm not trying to trivialize it. I'm saying having a plaque in and of itself is probably not problematic. It is the context and the milieu of the plaque itself that causes the problem. So if you have atherosclerosis in your dick, yeah, that might be a problem, right? If you have a single fatty streak, like a tiny little bit of fatty streak in your coronary artery, that might actually not be a problem if it never ruptures and forms a thrombus, right? Like it's context dependent. And none of us
would agree with that. But again, like, why would you want to, like, not do everything you can to lower the chance of that happening? And you agreed as well that having lower LDL will definitely, make that less likely to happen.
LDL what?
Well,
LDL
I mean,
what? What subfraction of LDL are you talking about here?
Well,
because remember
when you said before, though, you said that it's really any or all of them, and that's what the chart that we went through.
I never said it was any or. I didn't say it was any or all of them. In fact, I took great care to mention that it actually depends on the type of LDL particle we're talking about. Are we talking about
but they
modified
all
LDL
correlate.
particle?
They all correlate to eating more saturated fat and cholesterol.
Well, no, that's complete nonsense right there. Like, I mean, okay.
So I would love to see a study where you can show me any type of cholesterol and saturated fat intake that will not increase all of the particles, like any component.
So wait, what? I mean, there are tons of these studies.
Because you're saying the LDL-C or the LDL-P or whatever. What I'm saying is they all track to saturated fat and cholesterol consumption. It's just that, like, various things that you can eat, and you've mentioned this in your email back, like various things that you can eat, like if it's like this kind of meat, grass-fed meat or not grass-fed meat, or this kind of animal product versus that kind of animal product, it will like increase one more so than the other, but they all go up.
I mean, you got to be. I mean, saturated fat is not just. It's not just a nutrient. It's fractionated into like a huge assortment of nutrients. I mean, when you say saturated fat, are you talking about capric acid? Are you talking about caprylic acid? Are you talking about myristic acid? You're talking about lauric acid? Are you talking about myristic acid? Or are you talking?
And this is what you said, that those things will produce different types of like outcomes of which parts of the cholesterol will basically be changed, or like it'll change the ratios, or it'll change like your profile, like the HDL to LDL ratio and all this kind of stuff. But what happens is they all go up. It's not like yeah, your HDL might go up, but your LDL goes up too. It's not
but your triglycerides go down because typically when you do this, when you're eating extra saturated fat to the exclusion of carbohydrate, you will see your LDL go up. You will see your HDL go up by a non-trivial margin, because small incremental increases in HDL are way more important than small incremental increases in LDL. You'll see your HDL go up in a non-trivial manner, and you'll see your triglycerides tank, right? So you've created the opposite phenotype that has been established as problematic. The only difference is the LDL is still high. What I'm saying is that an independent risk factor, and no data that I've ever seen has divulged that. In fact, all the
stuff I've seen from the plant-based doctors that criticize this line of thinking, they all say, well, no, but I haven't seen a good retort like to it, and I just want to know what your retort to it is. Yeah, you bump up your HDL, which is a good thing. It's generally considered to be a good thing if you have a high HDL, but you also so you'll boost that by whatever, I don't know, 5-10%, let's say, but then you also increase your LDL by a much bigger. So like the boost that you get from like a 5% HDL improvement, is that really offsetting the problematic like LDL component getting boosted by say 15 or 20 or 30%, or in some cases it's even worse than that.
But those effects are seen in people with ApoE, with aberrant ApoE genotypes. That doesn't happen with everybody. Some people eat saturated fat, nothing happens to their lipids because they're not ApoE. They don't have a single nucleotide polymorphism to ApoE. Like, it's context dependent. In 17% of the population, maybe they shouldn't be eating saturated fat. Maybe it'll bump their lipids and send everything in the wrong direction. That's possible. But for people for whom that doesn't happen, it's not a nutrient to consume.
I would want to see something on that. I don't know if you sent any on that specifically, but I have never heard that somebody can eat saturated fat and it won't increase their
There's
their
a doctor.
LDL.
There's a doctor I follow on Twitter named Peter Attia, and you could see like he did tons of labs on himself. And there's also Dave Feldman. He did tons of labs on himself, and when he gorges on saturated fat over a course of 3 days, his LDL goes down.
Okay,
and he has this document.
Like, this is not a study. This is an anecdote.
No, it's not. It's
but
not
like
a study.
What I'm saying is, like, show me a study of any kind of like where it's not just some freak genetic mutation or something like that. Show me a study where people are being fed saturated fat and their LDL doesn't go up.
I sent you that study. It's a meta-analysis of dietary intervention trials.
And most of those are, at least all the ones I've looked, and I told you I didn't have time to go through the studies you sent yesterday, but all the ones that I've seen that show no correlation are ones where people are already at either very high levels of cholesterol, so that feeding them more saturated fat or cholesterol won't move it up anymore. That's like the most common version of it. So, I mean, I don't know if the specifics of the ones you sent, but they'll likely fall into that. I will look in them.
No, but now you're injecting more variables, right? So like we're just looking at saturated fat. In fact, I was trying to keep the variables as low as possible by saying coconut oil, right? But okay, let me go for a second. Okay, so I sent you a meta-analysis of dietary intervention trials that they did throughout the 60s. And this is when they actually did these trials. You don't do them anymore because they're technically considered unethical and they're too expensive to do. But they did them back then because it was like the wild, wild west of science, and they just wanted to see what happened, right? So there were a few trials wherein they put people on diets that were restricted saturated fat. And these diets were not like particularly high in animal foods. I mean, and they had people who, in fact, the people on the... They had other groups that had commensurately higher polyunsaturated fat intake. So basically, they were just seeing what kind of events will we see, what kind of outcomes will we see if we just restrict saturated fat for these people and give these people polyunsaturated fat. And basically, at the end of the meta-analysis, it's a null outcome. There's, in terms of cardiovascular outcomes, nothing happens. Either way, nothing happens. But there was one trial that went on for 8 years with a 3-year follow-up, and the people who were getting the polyunsaturated fat got more cancer, and a statistically significant amount of cancer in the years after, right? Like, in terms of cardiovascular disease outcomes, which is what we're talking about, it has not been divulged in any of the literature that restricting saturated fat helps at all for these outcomes. And the literature in which it does divulge that, you find out that there's actually something really, really wrong with the study. And this is not just me being a crazy low carb guy. There's actually something wrong with the study. So take the example of the Finnish mental hospital study. They had one hospital eating saturated fat. They had another hospital eating polyunsaturated fat. But the thing is that they randomized the hospital, right? They didn't randomize the subjects. There were subjects coming in and out of these hospitals all the time. But this study will be cited as evidence that eating saturated fat causes heart disease. But the hospitals were not tracking patients. They were tracking outcomes within the hospital because the hospital was the unit of randomization, right? So at the end of the trial, they find out, oh my God, you're eating polyunsaturated fat, and you you can lower your risk of heart disease. But then if you look in the data during the time period in which they were doing the trial in the saturated fat hospital, they were giving these people a cardiotoxin. So I mean, like some of these trials are horribly confounded. And I sent you a meta-analysis that has these trials. The trials that weren't confounded were excluded from the criteria, and the trials that actually met the criteria for, they were well controlled, they were some of them were double blind, like the very, very tip top of the evidence hierarchy. And there was a null effect. There was no effect on cardiovascular outcomes. In fact, some of the trials were just right of one. Some of the trials were just left of one, but there was no wide sweeping variation.
But
right?
Nick, again, I ask you, what levels were they at? Like, what were their baseline measurements when they started? I mean, did you look at that? Were any of them like vegans, and then they start feeding them more?
I just don't think that's. I just don't think that's relevant.
It is relevant because that there's a top off point. So it's like if people are already like at a very high level, consuming more saturated fat won't change it.
There's a top off.
That's how most of these you can't look for correlation in a cross-sectional observation study for cholesterol. People have known this since the 60s.
So, quick question. I believe this without a shadow of a doubt. Too much of something can be bad, right? I think for me, and I'm just speaking for myself. So I know that we've talked about this past about like 150, right, for cholesterol. So if somebody is consuming animal products and they're able to keep their total cholesterol below 150, in my case below 120, what are my chances of what's my risk level? Because if I can agree, which I totally can, that too much of something can be bad, but I'm eating a whole foods diet, whole plant-based foods diet, and I do include meat products in that diet, but I have a healthy, lipid level, healthy cholesterol, sugar levels, great. So if I can have this, I guess me sitting here listening to you guys go back and forth, and my causal factors ultimately are low for having heart attack, what's the real, I'm looking at it like, okay, well, you guys keep talking about heart attack. And I'm like, well, what's the big deal? Because
Mike, if you remember our conversation, what I said to you was that if your cholesterol is below that, then to the best of my understanding, and if all your other markers are good, you're probably fine. You're probably not going to get a heart attack. I don't know if Nick, if you'd say something else. I don't know. I don't think you would.
Okay, well,
so if we can agree that there's a way to eat meat product, and I think there is, right? I think if there's a way to eat healthy food and eat a holistic, healthy food diet that mitigates the risk for cardiovascular disease, and we can all admit that, why don't we start talking about, because I don't think either of you are gonna change your guys' mind. Can we come to a middle ground and say too much of something? You know what I mean? I get where you're coming from. I really do, BRB. And I obviously know where conscious omnivore comes from because I've followed him for so long. But I just think that, when we're talking about heart attack, I definitely think that if you are intaking too much of something, we can have these, everything in moderation. And for me, plant-based diet's the way to go. Now, I do put meat products in there, but I don't see, from my health, I don't see it causing this huge detriment where it's like, oh my gosh, it's going to happen. It's going to happen soon. Or I don't even see indicators that, it would be a problem in the future. So if we can agree, then maybe we should probably move on to something else that's, maybe we can move on to more of the ethics. Because I'm curious before this is over to hear your ethics, BRB, because I saw the video that you had with the fish and then all the other stuff, and I thought that was super awesome when you're talking about the nervous system and everything. So I'd definitely love to pick your brain on that a little bit. Just what I would like to get done at least before this is over. That's just kind of where I'm coming from.
I really don't have an interest really in discussing ethics, because when you discuss ethics with a vegan, they will invariably break it down to they will invariably either bring up the AMC, which is the argument for marginal cases, or they will bring up the name the trade argument.
Sure.
This invariably happens. And I'm not particularly persuaded by either of those points.
Sure.
But the thing is that whenever I say I'm not persuaded by them, it turns into a 2-hour conversation, and I'm not I mean, like the name the trait argument, like, okay, yeah, it's an interesting rhetorical device, but I don't think it actually susses out a legitimate formal contradiction like it's proposed to suss out. Like, I think it susses out a double standard that is yet to be justified, which is not the same thing as a contradiction.
I agree, and the reason why and that's why when I sent you the original message, I think we agree, but we disagree, and the way we disagree, I feel like whenever I talk to people that are vegans, like we can talk, especially the last video that Conscious Omnivore you did with the doctor, I was literally like, oh my gosh, like when he was talking about organic versus how we should just keep going with the way plant agriculture is now. I was literally like, oh my gosh, is this guy really a doctor? Is he really serious? Because I live in I'm not as intellectual as you guys are as far as talking about what ifs and let's talk about hypotheticals, because I look at the here and now. I look at the realism of it. And when you look at, if you go to the store and you're buying plant products or any products, there is a death count attached to it. You know what I mean? Like there is, because you're talking about child labor. You're talking about
we're inextricably
pesticides. Yeah, you're talking about like death count. So I look at it from a permaculture standpoint, and I'm like, okay, well, if it's evil to intentionally poison an animal for food products, is it less evil to dispatch an animal and use the animal in its entirety? Like when you're talking about ethics, like I get the point of, well, if we live in this hypothetical world, but since we don't, can we go back and talk about the real world? Because if we don't talk about the real world, I don't think we're going to make fixes, and that's,
A vegan would probably, like an astute vegan would probably respond to that and say, like, would you dispatch would you dispatch a human being who is of equal cognitive capacity to the animal that you're dispatching? And that's the standard that they would hold you to typically.
Yeah. So as the only vegan, I would actually like to comment on that. So sure. Nick, basically, I don't know if you watched the whole interview there, or the debate with it was an interview. Sorry, the debate or discussion with Carnival. I mean, the whole point is, I personally don't use name. Yeah, I don't use name the trait. The only reason why we talked about name the trait was really because he wanted to talk about it, and I told him I'm not an expert on it and I don't use it myself. So that's definitely not the way I go. And I don't do the marginal cases thing either. I simply just go for basically like a really simplified version of the golden rule. It's like, do I treat people the way that I want to be treated? And my whole argument for veganism is as simple as this. I think that you can have really good health by eating a whole food plant-based diet. And if you can be healthy and you just simply choose to eat animal products because you like the taste or because it's convenient or it's, whatever, something that isn't related to your health, then there I just simply try to make a moral argument that, if you don't need to do it, then why do you do it? And, would you want it done to yourself if you knew that it wasn't necessary? That's my argument, and it's quite simple. So I don't know if you've ever heard it put that way, but.
Well, I mean, like, it seems to be just a variation on the argument for marginal cases, because they both basically stab at the golden rule as the heart of the matter.
So, but what would you say to that? I asked Carnival this question. I'll ask you. If somebody like me, who in almost 3 years now as a vegan, eating pretty much like a whole food plant-based diet, I've seen all of my health markers get better. My recovery time is better. My performance in bed is better. Everything, my eyesight has improved, and every marker that I can see has shown me that I'm healthier now than I was before, and I didn't have any health problems before either. So it's not like I was eating a junk standard American diet. I was actually eating a very healthy diet and doing lots of exercise before, and I continue to do that now. So for somebody like me, if I just say, I just miss the taste of bacon and I just want to go eat, animal products, like, do you see that is a moral question? And do you think that it is immoral for me to just go and kill an animal just because I like the taste?
I think that anybody who can find health with a vegan diet should probably pursue a vegan diet, although that doesn't represent the majority of people. I don't think that represents. I'm not quite sure how many people that represents, but
that's already way beyond what.
Just let me finish.
I just want to commend you, because you've already gone way above and beyond what Carnival was willing to do, because he wouldn't even answer that.
He's an ideologue. He's an ideologue.
Thank you. Go ahead. I didn't want to interrupt you. I just wanted to commend you.
No, I am equally as critical of carnivores because their position to me is equally absurd. So, okay, if you can find health on a vegan diet, I think you should do a vegan diet. I mean, like, if your health has never been better and you're on a vegan diet, you should keep doing that, right? Like, that's just the sane thing to do until
I also agree.
until you hit an impasse, right? And many people do, right? My wife is a very good example of this. For whatever reason, I don't know, but iron as a phytonutrient is extremely poorly absorbed by her body. She cannot play with it. So if she tries to go on a whole food plant-based diet, she gets anemic to the point where it is life-threatening. And that is something that we dealt with for a very long time. And it doesn't matter if she's supplementing B12. It doesn't matter if it's cyanocobalamin, methylcobalamin, hydrocobalamin. It doesn't matter. And she was on 150 milligrams of elemental iron per day, which gave her huge GI problems, right? Like, and the thing is that her blood markers for iron were all going in a crazy bad direction until her doctor said, I don't know what you're doing, but if you keep doing it, we're going to have to intravenously infuse iron into your blood because that's the only way to get your iron up. So I said to her, well, you know what? There are a few case reports. There are people out there who, for whatever reason, only find heme iron to be bioavailable to them. I don't know why that is, but that seems to be the case for some people. We were both largely vegan at the time. And I was like, as much as it sucks, maybe you should be eating steak. And then she ate steak every day for 30 days, and boom, her anemia went away. Within 30 days, her anemia got better. It was like a lifelong problem that resolved itself in less than a month. I mean, her red blood cells at the time were still small, but the doctor said that would resolve if she kept doing what she was doing, right? So I think what I don't find persuasive about the vegan anecdotes, and also I don't find this persuasive about the carnivore anecdotes, is that you have people who are basically they're giving you their firsthand testimony on their self-selected diet, right? It's a self-selected diet. They're not part of a randomized trial. They weren't given this diet. They selected this diet because it made them feel better. And the people who, for the people for whom that diet knocked their dick in the dirt, like my wife, they're not doing that diet anymore, right? So that when people say, I went vegan and now I'm healthier than I ever have been before, well, you've self-selected a diet that worked for you. You can't extrapolate from there that diet will work for everybody, because it doesn't, right? When I go vegan, I get fat as hell. I just keep on gaining weight until I titrate some form of animal product back into my diet. I have to titrate at least some proportion of animal products into my diet unless I want my joints to hurt. Like, that's just me. That's my personal testimony on the subject. So, but then then a vegan might turn around and say, okay, would you kill a human being who is, trait equalized to that of a cow to spare your joint pain? And
well, and I'd like to address the name the trait thing right quick, but yeah, I would say, and I think Avi has already started commenting, so I think he wants to wreck me. But no, so when we're talking about organic, right? We're talking about permaculture. Yeah, when you're talking about, like, for example, the biggest organic farm in the Northern Hemisphere is SoCal Farms. It's 25,000 acres. Canadian tar sands alone destroy 65,000 acres annually. So when you're talking about organic, this is not a huge industry, but the industry does use animal products from slaughterhouses. I'm okay with every slaughterhouse going away. I mean, that's not I don't care. That wouldn't hurt my feelings at all. I would also like to see plant agriculture go away as well. Absolutely. I'd like to see them both go away. Now, I realize that that's not feasible for the entire population of the world, but at the end of the day, we're doing a lot of damage, and it's going to come to a tipping point eventually, right? And that's beyond any of our control. But when we're talking about where people are getting their food now, right? We're talking about plant agriculture now. The idea that we're going to spray stuff with cancer, the idea that we're getting 70% of all child labor comes in the plant agriculture industry alone, the hundreds of million animals that die. Just give me a number of what's justifiable an intentional poisoning, intentional death, and we can, and we can start there, because that's just the sad truth of plant agriculture, right? There's a way to do permaculture. I do it without using blood or bone meal, right? It comes from manures. Aquaponics is a great example of that, right?
I like.
But you're talking about but you're talking about the enslavement of fish. Or I can make it sound nice and say there's sanctuary. It's a sanctuary tank, So
depends if you're eating them at the end or not.
You know what I mean? So when you're talking about these discussions, that's something important to mention. As far as the name your trait, obviously I'm coming at this from a different perspective. I look at it in the reality, The only reason why humans in certain parts of the world, take America, Canada, Europe, certain places, the only reason why humans have rights at the end of the day is because there are some people out there, men and women, that are willing to engage in violence to make sure that the people that they want to ascertain those rights have those rights. You can say God gave them to humans. People can say whatever reason, but at the end of the day, somebody's willing to die for it. Somebody's willing to use violence in order to have those rights. So if we're wanting equal rights for animals, the only way to keep those rights, and those rights are slowly going away in every first world country, United States, Canada, the like. But then the day, the only reason we have those rights aren't because, hey, God gave this to us, or this is just what our founder said. Somebody is willing to enact force. And at the end of the day, that's the truth. I mean, we can talk about, the psychology of it. We can talk about how, we need to be better. And let's look at it from, if you could press this button, and it's going to, we can talk about that all day. But at the end of the day, the only reason why people enjoy rights in certain parts of the world is because somebody's willing to enact violence to keep them. So if animals want to have the same rights, you're going to have to say, hey, I'm willing to sacrifice my brother, my sister, my mom, my dad, myself in order to keep those. And you can use diplomacy, but at the end of the day, it's only going to be cauterized by the fact that people are willing to engage in violence to keep that tribal mentality. And that's just the truth. I don't see how anyone can argue that that's not the case. That's not how rights are maintained. I just don't see it.
I think we should do a debate on that separately, because that's a huge topic. But
I would
definitely say the opposite. Yeah, I would argue the opposite of what you just said.
But ultimately, okay. So name the trait. Name the trait's an argument that goes like this. Like, could you name a trait that's absent in animals that, if absent in humans, would cause humans to lose moral value? I think that's a little bit of a tricky way to phrase it, and I don't mean tricky as though it's difficult to reckon with. It's a rhetorical trick, right? Because it gives the opponent the impression that the trait is has to be one word, right? Like a trait is it can be broken down due to a subset of characteristics, which I think is the linchpin of that whole thing. I have skin. Skin's a trait, and skin can be broken into a subset of characteristics, thousands of characteristics, right? So for name the trait, all you really need to do is say okay, name the trait that, differentiates animals and humans in terms of the moral salience they have. So, okay, membership to a distinct classification of entities that start rattle off as many criteria as it takes to include everything you want to eat and exclude everything you don't want to eat. And that's ultimately the linchpin of the whole thing. You just run out of words before you run out of facts, right? Can you even
name just a few of those? Because I really think
I'm just saying in principle. I'm just saying in principle that's how you'd answer it.
No,
I'm just saying in principle that's how you'd answer it.
I think you're missing the point, because the things that you would say are you would say, okay, intelligence in and of itself isn't enough, but then you would just add on something else, like intelligence and I don't know, social structure, and then okay, that's not enough, okay, add language, and then add. But you can find animals that fit those as well. And you just need to sufficiently mangle the sentence to differentiate the two groups the way you like it. I mean, how what are some of the examples that you would add? Really, what do you not see in animals?
I'm just saying what you would need to do. I'm not going to rattle off an infinite number of qualifiers. I'm just saying that that's what you need. I don't think you could do it. And I don't think it's a question of time.
So what's the justification for plant agriculture then? If life is sentient and we should be doing everything we can to stop it and get rid of it, just give me a number of justifiable deaths and justifiable child enslavement. Just give me a number and we can start there,
Here's the thing, right? So, would you would you think like picking strawberries is more abusive to a human, or like killing cows all day and like cutting up chickens, and like which one do you think would scar you more mentally?
Which one scarred me more mentally? Dispatching my food versus picking strawberries. I mean, I don't think I'm scarred by either.
Okay, but
I can tell you different events that I am scarred by.
I'm just
sure.
Okay. So maybe I'll just ask you: Have you ever seen like stats on people who work in slaughterhouses? They have really high levels of post-traumatic stress disorders. They have like tons of like physical problems. They amputate fingers by mistake. They're working like extremely stressful conditions, long hours. Some of them like wear diapers because they don't get to go on breaks and stuff like that. I mean, it's like a horrifically abusive situation. Now, if I was an illegal immigrant, like a poor third world country immigrant to the U.S., and I'm either like picking strawberries in California or working in a slaughterhouse, I would pick the strawberries.
Right.
I think all of these things are
like,
so, and that's fine. But at the end of the day, you got to look at. I mean, I'm looking at the reality and the totality of it. And at the end of the day, every plant product that you buy in a grocery store does have a body count attached to it. So if we're talking overall, and if we're talking, we're talking about overall, ethics of it, the fact that you have to wash the food, or the food has to be washed before you eat it because it was intentionally poisoned to kill something. Like I said, have your vegan diet, be a vegan. I'm totally cool with it. But the ethics and the virtue signaling that comes with it, I just find it hard. I have to do mental gymnastics, because I look at it, dispatching a rabbit and using it into totality versus, poisoning an animal just because you don't want it to eat your yield and then letting it fall where it may and poison the earth in which it falls. Like, which one's worse?
I can address it too, but I know Nick wanted to get something in there, so go ahead.
I just think that all of these points are secondary to what if we're still talking about name the trait. I don't know if we are, but like I think all of these points are kind of secondary to what it's trying to tease out. Like it's basically trying to tease out inconsistency, right? Well, it claims that it's trying to tease out inconsistency. I'm not quite sold that that's actually what it's doing. I think as a rhetorical device, I mean, like it's interesting and it can get people on board with veganism and whatever. But basically, it's asking people, whatever you do for animals, or whatever you do toward animals for your own sustenance, for the sake of moral consistency, you should be equally okay doing that to humans, provided that the humans are trait equalized to that of an animal. And, and if you really lean into this hard, you end up finding out that the trait equalized animal that they're proposing in this hypothetical is just a cow wearing a human costume. So, I mean, like, if it's just a cow eating a human costume, I'd eat it.
Yeah, I think you've misunderstood it a little bit, Nick, honestly. The point isn't to say that you should then, I think Carnival was also trying to say the same thing.
No,
if it's okay to rape the animal, then it's okay to rape the mentally challenged person, the retard. The point isn't that you should be okay to rape the retard. Like, the point is that you wouldn't do that to the mentally handicapped person. So you also shouldn't do it to the other. So you're kind of twisted it backwards. No,
name the trait actually isn't prescriptive. It's not saying that you should do anything.
But the way you phrased it just now, it made it sound like that.
Well, there's something that it's clearly intended to tease out from the perspective of the person positing it. But in terms of the actual thought experiment itself, it's not prescriptive. It's not saying that you need to be vegan. It just says that you need to be consistent along whatever trait you select, right? So if you say intelligence, if a certain threshold of intelligence is the trait, then as long as you're okay eating everything that is below that threshold of intelligence, including humans, you're consistent, and I can't attack you on the basis of logic alone. All I can say is that I disagree with you, right? Like, that's what name the trait is trying to tease out. What I'm saying is that if you sufficiently mangle a sentence with a long enough string of qualifiers that all operate as subset characteristics of that single trait, and even if you make it infinitely long, you can just keep on adding stuff to it to section off whatever animals you want to eat from whatever animals you don't want to eat, right? Like, you can get 90% of the way there by saying, the trait is membership to a distinct classification of entities that individually or collectively have the immediate potential for sapience. And you get like 90% of the way there if you're an omnivore.
What is sapience? Right? I don't know that word.
Sapience is the capacity to assimilate and apply complex knowledge. So like, for example, you could argue that a cow is not sapient, but a human is, but a mentally challenged human is not sapient either, right? But if you're the member of a group wherein one individual has sapience within the trait that I've named, if you're the member of a group, and I know the vulnerability is of the trait that I just named, but I just pulled it out of thin air, right? So like if somebody has any problems with it, all I have to do is stack on more qualifiers, right? Like I just stack on more characteristics until I get what I want, right? Like this is what philosophy is about. You just like rhetorical device versus another rhetorical device, and you just swap persuasion games until somebody changes their mind.
What do you think about a child? Because they haven't, and they're not mentally challenged. They're completely normal, but they just haven't developed yet.
Do they belong to a group wherein one individual has the immediate potential for sapience?
Oh, you said potential. Okay, sorry. Yeah. Okay.
So like you have to phrase it like cleverly, and even then it's vulnerable to certain things, because what the hell is a classification of entities, right? You could say that the kingdom of Animalia is a classification of entities of which humans are a part, so none of them are okay to eat. Right.
But I mean, this is again, though, kind of what I'm saying. Like, okay, sapience, I haven't heard that word before, but so complex. So have you seen the little thing where like the squirrel is taught like the 17 different, tricks to run through this, row the boat through that, and then like, push this button to drop that weight to do this. And then they have like these like 17 gazillion things that the animals are all, learning how to do and figuring out puzzles and all this kind of stuff. Like that's pretty complex. Like
it might be more helpful to actually look up like a definition of sapience. This is the exact kind of discussion I really didn't want to get into.
Okay, look, man, we don't.
No, I mean, I think
it's
great, But at the end of the day, I look at it from just real. I guess I look at things too realistically. But when we're talking about rights and why we have the rights, the reason why I can go out in the street and say something really bad about Donald Trump is because there's people that are willing to enact violence in order to keep a certain right or keep a certain privilege. Because at the end of the day, that's what safeguards those things. So, I think right or wrong, that's just the truth.
I think there's a real danger.
Sure.
Sorry. I just think there's a real danger that someday soon people will be enacting violence for you to not be able to say anything bad about Mr. Trump.
Exactly, and that's exactly true. And that's how it's been, and that's how it's been centuries wide. The only reason why we have rights is because of people willing to enact and saying, you know what, I'm willing to die for that. I'm willing to send my life, my children, my wife, my husband, and that's how human nature is. Unfortunately, it's uncomfortable, but that's just the truth. It's somebody willing
while
to.
Nick's looking up the definition, I just want to address the field question that you had. So, one thing that if you look at, grains and mass scale agriculture, what you have to realize is that a good chunk of it, I've seen stats from as low as 40%, but some say even over 50% of the grain gets fed to animals.
Totally agree. Horrible.
So if you're talking about, the deaths from like the grains and plants that are, like getting planted, getting rid of animal agriculture will go a long way to reducing that. So if you just even look at the lower figure, like, 40% or whatever you see, that's 40% that would immediately go away just by not having to feed the animals.
Right. Absolutely. And here's the thing. Well, I totally disagree, but I'll play around with it for this reason. If you're telling me overnight, let's say we can get rid of all animal culture overnight is just magically, we live in the Dr. Avi's world, and it goes away. And we're going to feed all that. We're going to keep the same practices because we can't change practices. We're going to keep the same practices, and we're just going to feed all that GMO, low quality, pesticide, herbicide, fungicide filled foods to human beings. You're still dealing with the child labor. You're still dealing with 100 million animals. Like the best case scenario is hundreds of millions of animals are still going to die because they have to get intentionally poisoned. Children still have to be exploited. And here you go. It's not like that. It's not like all that space is going to go back into green space because we have something called capitalism, right? That land is going to be used for something else. So you're still stuck with that thing that you have to deal with. And until we start doing what people like you are doing what people like me are doing, and other people, until we start viewing sustainable practices, here we are. We're still left with a really bad ethical dilemma. And people can disagree with that, but that's just the truth.
I will say one thing about the grains and the cows. Like the input to yield ratio in terms of how much it takes to get like a kilogram of beef is about 10-1. So like 10 kilograms of grain in, 1 kilogram of beef out. The FAO had a pretty big report on that. It was actually a report on edible insects, but there was a lot of agricultural data in there as well. So yeah, the efficiency is pretty bad with beef, and that's definitely an issue. But the thing is that you can't really frame it like you can use those grains for sustenance instead.
Exactly.
Like you can't really frame it like that, because like grains per calorie are like 1/10 the nutrition. And so, I mean, like you can't.
I'm not a fan of that either. Yeah, GMO grains.
So
to humans.
So the thing is this though, like the land that's being used to grow these can be adapted to grow other plants and vegetables. Sure. So I mean, just grazing like land can be easily converted to grow other types of vegetables. If Mike, I don't know if you've ever read the book by Seth Holzer, but you should read the book. He's got a book called Permaculture. And in the end of that book, he gives several projects that he's done around the world, because he's a guy. He's done amazing work in Austria. He's got a big farm like up in the Alps, and he grows stuff like out of zone and all this kind of stuff. He grows citrus up in the Alps.
That's awesome.
So, yeah, he does like amazing stuff with like microclimates and ponds and all this kind of stuff for storing heat and whole bunch of stuff. He's not a vegan at all. So he does like animal agriculture as well. He has like pigs and like rare, animals. But anyway, he's gone to all sorts of areas in the world to set up like permaculture farms. And like one of the examples in that book that they show is done in the grasslands of Scotland. And they're like very marginal, like very poor soil, like super, super bad quality. And through the use of like his methods, he's able to produce like amazing like vegetable
putting more carbon,
exactly. So
garden, no, I agree.
Yeah, so the problem is certainly possible. That's all I'm saying. Sure. It's possible.
Well, it is, but
need to change like over time. Everyone going vegan overnight is definitely a hypothetical that's like very, very extremely, extremely unlikely to happen.
No, and I get it, and I've saw actually vegans start to debate the palm oil thing, and I know that's an internal conversation between vegans that I don't want to get into, but just the idea that I think I'm all about permaculture. I'm all about it. That's what I do. But I understand that when you add capitalism into it, when you add that factor, I think capitalism is great because I'm able to do what I can do. I can go buy items to make an aquaponic system that can help my life. But as a grand scheme, when you're talking about highest yields to trying to get the most product, the idea that these are going to somehow go away and turn into, you're going to somehow have a 25,000 acre veganic garden, or that somehow you're going to be able to turn this back into environmental green space, that's not how these third world countries are set up. It's not even how America is set up. It's not the way capitalism works in that thought process isn't going to change anything. I don't see it. I don't see the math. I don't have seen that put forth. And then the only thing I've seen is when we look at Cuba, whenever we enacted the hard tariffs like Cuba and North Korea, Cuba thrived because the government said, okay, people, not government, not companies, people grow food in every arable place that you can, on rooftops and garden beds everywhere. That was the only way Cuba survived, right? So you have the Cuba and you have North Korea, and you see how they went about it. So it's really people taking the initiative themselves. It's not going to be a capitalist fix. This isn't going to be a government fix. So until people can start to realize that, we're stuck with the agriculture that we have today. That's just the plain brass tacks there. So I agree with everything you're saying, and I think that we should. And I think I have 5 solutions on how we can take this progressive steps towards that kind of society, because I've thought about it a lot. But the way we're going right now is actually opposite. And a lot of that has to do with, the free market, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think we've reached a point where we're largely in agreement, actually, between the three of us. I mean, I think, Nick even said that if somebody can be healthy on a vegan diet, they should. So that's like, I'm super happy to hear that. I mean, Mike, you're not vegan, but I've said it before when we were debating. If everyone was doing what you say that you're doing, then I think like we almost wouldn't be having these discussions to begin with, because I think people would be a lot healthier. There wouldn't be the health epidemic that we have, and I also think we wouldn't have the environmental catastrophe that we have. But I think that's the problem, is that people don't realize what kind of what kind of lifestyle that would entail. People aren't willing to get out there.
They're not willing. Yeah, they're not willing to do it. And I guess that's my biggest thing. That's what even got me started talking and have these discussions is, I put a video out there on something about sustainability, and I have a vegan attacking me, and I'm like, this is the guy that goes to the grocery store and buys his food and this and that, and just to have that kind of attack is just like, well, why aren't you guys doing more of what people like me and a lot of other people are doing? I just don't understand why there's such a pushback, because the same arguments that I bring up for, why agriculture is bad is the same. Well, it's hard. It's difficult. Not everybody can do that. Well, doesn't mean.
Well, I think there is a certain thing. I mean, if somebody's living in a high-rise building in New York, right? Like, I mean, there is only so much that they're going to be able to, grow in pots or something on their terrace.
I agree, but do something.
Yeah. And to some extent, people are doing that. So even here, like in Budapest, you see a lot of community gardens now, even in the inner city. So some of these like derelict, like basically like empty lots where like an old building got destroyed and now it's just like an empty lot. People are doing community gardens. People are doing this stuff. So it is changing. And I'm actually pretty optimistic. Like I really think like the world has to change, because if not, we're going to basically kill ourselves off. So I think there has to be some kind of solution. And I think people are adopting.
I'm not an expert on agriculture. I'm not qualified to comment on agriculture pretty much at all, because I have no real in-depth knowledge of it. But intuitively, mass agriculture seems like it would probably be necessary for a place like I live. Like I live in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, and it gets like, it's about minus 40 6 months out of the year. So. Sure. Yeah, I mean, you can't really grow anything here like 80%, 90% of the year. So it doesn't seem like, having our homes self-sustained in this climate is really very practical.
Nick, do you know a channel on YouTube? It's what's the lady's name? Kirsten Dickerson. She goes around the world and showcases like tiny homes usually, and like all these kind of interesting like sustainable farms and all this kind of stuff. She's got a really interesting channel. But anyway, she's got one where they show a guy after he retired. He was like 60-something years old. He built a greenhouse, and he's up in, I think, Minnesota, which they, can't be that different from where you are. So it's like really ridiculously cold, like long winters, like very little sun in the winter. They have tons of snow. And he built a greenhouse, and he's growing citrus up there. He actually uses geothermal heat for it. Lots of people have been doing like walipinis and other kinds of things. You can actually grow an insane amount of food in some of the northern latitudes. Also, because during the summer you get like a lot more sun because of the angle of the earth, the tilt. So you get like long summer growing seasons. You can grow like an insane amount of food, and you can obviously like preserve food in a lot of different ways. You can do canning, you can do freezing, you can do drying, salting, all sorts of different options. So it's certainly not impossible, but I think people do need to like learn more about it and just make more like efforts. Like if you have a yard, you can definitely grow something.
At the end of, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that whatever path toward greater sustainability can be, it can be within reach. I think we should take advantage of it. So that's interesting. I mean, I'll look into that.
Yeah, and then at the end of the day,
knowledge on this subject.
And at the end of the day, it's one of those things where even if because I know most people aren't, but just look at the practices of what goes into actual animal agriculture. It'd probably shock you if you look at all the chemicals that go into plants as inputs. So when we're talking about putting stuff into our body as inputs, as carcinogenic as bad, and then you want to totally just not and overlook the inputs that are put into plant agriculture. That's where for me, that's where like, well, why can't we be consistent? And if you just look at the practices that are going on, it's really eye opening. And as far as what you're talking about, extreme cold climates, yeah, I'm not going to lie, that's going to make it more difficult. But as technology is getting better, and as we're looking at things, aquaponics is great. Forget aquaponics. Look, because obviously fish enslavement's horrible, but hydroponics, like there's lots of other things that you can look into, and then you can use to grow food. And and even outside of that, look at the local laws that are really bad, not even just from an agriculture standpoint, but if you, especially in the United States, I can speak to this, just the renewable energy laws that are there are horrible. It's ridiculous, so those are different things that we should be looking at, and whenever I talk to people, I have like a 5-step that I usually go through that would help, that I think we should push forward. But yeah, I think that at the end of the day, I'm not asking everybody to be sustainable, but actually understanding where your food comes from and having at least some kind of knowledge. You don't have to have intimate knowledge. You don't have to be like me that, has, get compost, over 100, have 180 gallons worth of composting material and, human manure and stuff. Like, you don't have to do that. You don't have to be like me, but, at least have a knowledge of where it comes from. You don't have to have the intimate knowledge, but, having a baseline understanding of it, is super important. I know a lot of people asking what about baseball hat. It just says growing your greens. So yeah, I just think, I think it's super important to at least have an understanding. Even
I did dabble in this somewhat when I was living in an apartment. I tried vermicomposting for a while. I tried enslaving some worms to
you're
vermicompost, and then they all died.
That's unfortunate. Genocide.
Yeah, that's a bummer. But you didn't intentionally kill them, and you didn't intentionally breed them so you could kill them. So, I mean, yeah, and this is again going back to the agriculture question. Like, if you're growing vegetables, you can definitely unintentionally kill some things. I definitely am against any kind of like poisoning or pesticide use in my garden. I don't use any kind of chemicals whatsoever. Today I picked a ton of tomatoes and zucchinis and stuff. I'll have a video about that pretty soon, but you can see a few of them got kind of chewed up here and there, but like I'm perfectly fine with like losing some of the crop to some kind of bugs or insects or whatever. Like, I don't really care. I'm still not going to put any kind of chemicals on there. And some of the stuff you can actually use are really safe. Like, you can use like compost teas and things like that will keep away insects just because they don't like the smell of it, or maybe that it is actually kind of toxic to them in the sense that they just won't ingest it because they know to stay away from it. But you aren't actually harming them because you're not like mass spraying and like using like all sorts of synthetic kinds of things. It's like you take like stinging nettle and like let it rot in water basically, and then you just use that and spray it on.
Mint is also another good one.
Yeah, so there's lots of stuff that you can do, and you can companion plant things. So certain things can be planted next to each other. Like I think like around like peach trees, for example, if you plant like chives and like basil, that actually keeps away certain bugs that actually prefer the peaches or the apricots. So there's things like that you can do. It won't completely like eliminate all sorts of like bugs or pests, but it will definitely reduce it, and the amount of fruit that you lose is like pretty minimal. So
yeah, I agree. All good stuff there. It's true. It's good stuff.
All right, guys. It's been a blast. I think I'm gonna say that we end it here because it's a little after midnight for me, and it's been really good. I'm glad we had this talk. I hope you guys enjoyed it too. But it was fun for me.
Yeah, I enjoyed myself.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thank you so much, man. Always
Thanks
a pleasure.
for having me.
All right. Thanks, everybody. So for everybody watching, thank you. And I'll have a link to everybody's channels in the description. I didn't put one in for Mike yet. Sorry, I was racing through to set up the stream. So I'll put your channel in there as well. Check everybody out, subscribe, and see you guys in the next one. Bye.